Hello and welcome to another in our live conversations at Let's Talk Leadership. Joining Brit and I today are two old friends, Phil and Anne. Old in the sense we've known them a long time, not necessarily in terms of any reference to age. But what we thought we'd do today is touch on a subject that might be a little bit sensitive, so we're going to tread carefully, but we want to explore how, in the light of recent developments with far more attention being paid on climate change and the environment, and obviously the pandemic that we're all going through, as to whether certainly leaders, both in organizations, governments, political parties, wherever they may be, need to perhaps refocus their attention, and that maybe there is a place coming out of the pandemic where, when we're talking about issues that impact the performance of a business or an organization, that we need to pay really close attention to the way we work and the places where we work, the impact we have on the climate and on our environment, and maybe rethink the conversations we have when we're looking at strategies and when we're developing sort of talking about leadership issues in our boardrooms and in our meeting rooms, redevelop our thinking and maybe focus more on that than purely the performance in terms of monetary gain. And the hypothesis is perhaps that if we focus on the environment, we focus on the climate, we focus on the way we work with people and the way we support people, whether they be employees or customers, that actually the natural outcome of that will be financial performance that we can be proud of. So that's where we're going to start. I'm not sure where it's going to lead to, but do join in the conversation, either using the chat function, or if you're watching this later and you suddenly want to get off your seat and shout at the wall because we've said something you disagree with, then do get in touch, because that's what this is all about. So I'm going to throw it open to Anne and to Phil and to Brit, just to say that I've been involved in one or two conversations where organizations that I'm working with are very seriously looking at the future of work, the way people work together, the flexi working. There's been quite a lot certainly in social media and the press, with organizations saying either that they desperately want to get back to working in offices and everyone in at 8 o'clock in the morning or whatever it might be, and others saying actually they're getting rid of offices, they're getting rid of facilities because they recognize in the future they no longer need them. So that's where I just think I'd like to hear what my colleagues and friends have to say about any of this from different perspectives. So I don't know who wants to kick off, but feel free to just start and we'll see where the conversation goes.
I'll give it a try, Matthew. So I noticed three things that have occurred more often as we're coming out of coronavirus times, hopefully rapidly in the next few months, that organizations face big challenges as they open and adapt and change to new circumstances, and that they're having to make new arrangements to face these challenges. And so examples of that would be, there's very publicly a lot of companies are firing and rehiring. So basically asking staff to reapply for their jobs under what is nearly always lesser terms and conditions, or not as favorable terms and conditions. And so a change that's happened there. We have a phenomenon in the pubs and restaurants here, which is called summer hours, similar to the gig economy, where you're basically paid for the work and booked in immediate hours. Summer hours is something which is that you're called into work if it's sun shining, so that you can serve at tables which are outdoors, as opposed to if it's rainy. This must be a very British phenomenon, but if it's raining, then they're not going to expect, pubs are not going to expect as many clients, and so won't need as many staff, and so you may be working summer hours, which is that you're just called in when the weather is good. A version, I guess, of the gig economy, which at the same time is being challenged by a number of collectives of people who are challenging the idea that they are not employees, but are and don't have rights as employees. All of this strikes me as change which is happening with the contract between employee and employer. And I'm struck by the fact that so much of this does seem to be being handled not very well in the public domain. And so companies making good economic decisions and doing their best in terms of survival, but not handling their reputation very well. Possibly something to do with the way in which they handle social media and the way in which everything is very visible. But it struck me as that part of this is the context for so many changes that are happening nowadays.
Yeah, and we've noticed it obviously recently in the challenges about the freedom of movement and the freedom of demonstration and the freedom to express your views in a peaceful, non-violent way, and how in the recent pandemic, how that has impacted in terms of the way certainly the police have been challenged in the way they handle those situations. Local government officials have been challenged in the way that they put out information about what can and cannot happen. I just sense that there are a number of things happening in society, which means that whatever happens in the future, people will have to behave, leaders will have to think about things and behave in ways that they might not have had to have paid attention to before. Because people, whether it's to do with the climate change movement, whether it's to do with the way, the reaction to what's happened recently in London and elsewhere in the world, the reaction that's happened, to do with the situation in Myanmar, there's people, all of us have to sort of look at these things, I think, in a rather different way coming out of all of this. I think I just sense we're at a turning point where we don't talk about getting back to a new normal. But I think the new normal means that as leaders, we have got to consider a whole range of things that we might not have done before.
So when you two talk, what it makes me think of, and I suppose this has popped into my mind, it's an issue that we're dealing with leaders, but also yesterday watching on the news that, biometric passports, suddenly they're becoming a likelihood. So to me, that's about freedom and what we give and what we're willing to show of ourselves, and how much the state has control and other people know about us. And I think, so set against what you two said, I think we are also completely seeing the opposite of that. And maybe it's in different parts of society, which is actually, people are trying to have more involvement in their conditions of work, the ways of working, where they work, and being quite demanding because they've had more freedom. Not everybody, of course, some people have had less freedom, and we've all had less freedom overall. But in terms of how they work, quite a number of people have had more freedom, and they're wanting that going forward. So I think that there's also a pull. You're talking about summer hours and being told when you can work and what we've got to offer you, Phil. But I think there's the other side, which is there's an expectation amongst leaders that they will self-lead and they'll demand what's in themselves and shape their own contributions. So I think it's how we distribute power in the future is going to be really important, and what democracy means in the world of work.
Mm-hmm. And also the role of trust crops up, as it usually does whenever we speak about anything. There was a piece in the news this morning in the Netherlands about the increased use of what they call spy software that certain companies and certain bosses employ in order to check that those who are working from home are really sitting on the desks, and that comes back to the freedom and the individuality, and the fact that not everybody will like. I mean, I'd be the first one to say no to that. Being watched by your superior just because they're not in an office and they just want to be sure. It's like trust but verify. They just want to be sure. That the whole issue around privacy will start to come into play in a lot of these situations as well. How far can you go? And When is it an infringement?
Yeah. And it seemed that, again, to Anne's point, that seems to play both ways, because I could imagine that if I'm in the workplace and I feel I'm being spied upon, that destroys any trust that I would have. In fact, it would almost drive me to say, right, I'm giving up working here, I'm working somewhere else.
Yeah.
And yet, when we are in a situation where there's violence taking place in society, or where someone tragically has been kidnapped, murdered, something has happened, we immediately turn to street cameras, private security cameras, helicopters, drones, to be able to spot within a minute or two of where someone was, or what they were doing, or who was with them. And we find, to a certain extent, we find it acceptable. So I think, again, when it comes to us personally in the workplace, it's one thing. When it comes to society, is that different? How does that play out?
And it reminds me of something that's been around for a long time, which is the idea that there's a psychological contract between an employee and an employer, or an individual and an organization, or the state. And a psychological contract is not the formal written terms and conditions that are operating, but the goodwill that exists in both directions, and the trade-offs that people are willing to make, and the compromises and the trust that exists on both parts. And it strikes me that if you get part of that contract wrong, or even worse, if your intentions are misinterpreted, then it can lead to a break or a derogation of the contract on both parts, which might be an appropriate response if you're having your hours cut, or you're having your pay cut, or your terms and conditions are getting less, and you think, well, how much am I going to give in terms of goodwill if the goodwill is lessening in the direction that I have? But it also might be that the whole story is not there, and the psychological contract is out of balance just because of mixed messages or misinterpretation, or people doing things for good reasons, employers, organizations doing things for good reasons, but it not being seen that there's good intentions behind what they're doing. And so it landing badly with everybody.
Yeah, I suppose it gets me onto one of my sort of favorite topics. Is I often wonder, and it's perhaps going to sound naive, why it is that leaders cannot just be straight with people, why they cannot just tell it as it is, as opposed to being worried about how it might land in the press or on social media, or, they have their gurus that advise them on how to do all these things. And there are vast corporate communication departments who sort of sensitize everything and cleanse it. And I think one of the things that certainly I've been struck by is, if certainly at a political level, if people had just come clean at the beginning and said, we really have never experienced whatever it might be before, ever. We are fumbling and fumbling our way through, trying to make sense of all of this. So bear with us. We are doing our best, but our best may not look terribly good to you at the moment. And you may think you could do better. However, here are some things that we have to contend with. The lovely, we've all talked about dilemmas, but the lovely dilemma about how you keep society open, and how you and keep the economies going and save people's jobs, and at the same time keep people safe. And that's been writ large, and yet no one's actually ever talked about that. They've just been accused of either moving in one direction or moving in another. Mm-hmm. And you just think, come on, isn't this time for certainly at a corporate level, for organizations to be led by people who are prepared to put themselves out there, be a bit vulnerable, and engage with employees, engage with customers, engage with suppliers, engage with other political organizations, and make something different happen. Mm-hmm. They seem reticent. They seem worried that their shares are going to fall, or that something awful is going to happen to them.
Yeah. Whereas there's also just a report out that says that the number of billionaires in the world has never been as high as now. Yeah. And the extremely wealthy have almost all gotten extremely more wealthy than they were before the pandemic hit. So there's such an enormous amount of inequality. But to your point, Matthew, about the coming out with the truth and saying to people, look, we don't know, we're finding out as we go along, bear with us. I think there's an innate sense that people who are in power, whether it's in government or as CEO of a large corporation, they should know what's happening. They should know best. They should take the best decisions. And if they can't, then they're in the wrong position, which is a fairly naive view. But I think that a lot of people may tend in that direction. You know, the sort of the idea of, well, we're not paying you to say, I don't know. Whereas that would be actually the most honest thing to hear.
Yeah, I think, and again, we're back to the contractual thing that Phil was talking about. You know, should senior leaders be employed on the basis of not what they know, but their preparedness to make decisions on things where they have to at least look at the data, look at the information, look at the sensing systems they have, and say, with the best will in the world, I'm never going to make an ideal, decision on this. But actually, my best considered opinion is that we should do this or we should do that, and therefore I'm going to influence the rest of my colleagues to come along with it.
I do think that. Well, no, I think that senior leaders, you've presented the dilemma that I think faces a lot of senior leaders is, they want to still be liked and respected, and some have more of a need to being liked, and they also have to, especially the CEO. Have you lost it?
I think Matthew's gone for a while, but he'll be back in a moment. I think this comes back to one of the things we've talked about in the past, which is leadership becoming too transactional and not enough based on the relationships between leaders and the people around them. And it's almost as if the focus on the transactional part detracts from the good relationships which can underpin what are difficult decisions in difficult times and trust between different parties. And I think it is sometimes difficult for leaders because their intentions can be misread unless they make them really clear. These are difficult times. I mean, the pandemic has left a lot of organizations facing big challenges and harsh decisions, which there'll be winners and losers from. And if these are just led in a way which is purely economic and transactional, then of course people are going to make sure that their own interests are defended only. And I think a better working relationship between people is something that is very often neglected by leaders.
Yeah, I don't know. There's just something I feel that gives us an opportunity to challenge. I mean, I've noticed one or two organizations that I'm close with really refocusing on societal issues and environmental issues, still being hugely successful at what they do, but the whole language has changed. The language has shifted from, quarterly results, end of year profits, shareholder value, into, by doing certain things, we can create a future for this organization, for the employees of the organization, which means that we can survive and grow and prosper in a new environment. But we need to do things differently. We need to focus on different things. We need to report on different things. We do need to think about how we employ people. And it's no longer good enough to say we're all going to go back at the end of this to how it was before. That's finished, that's gone. Well, it's just the challenge it then creates for leaders at any level. I mean, I was in a conversation yesterday where we were talking about expansive thinking, encouraging people to think wider and wider and wider and challenging us. so that it's not challenge for challenge's sake, but looking at something that's going on and constructively challenge that maybe there's a different way of looking at this. And that's going to collide, and that was sort of encouraging younger people to do that, people in mid-level roles perhaps. And that's going to come up against, I think, this existing sort of view. It's still around in senior leadership, that somehow the senior leaders know what they're doing. They're the ones that take the decisions. They're the ones that formulate the strategy. They're the ones that sort of put the information out into the sort of marketplace. And I just think the challenges that are going to come is that people aren't going to accept that any longer, or they're going to want it delivered in a different way. And then therefore, how does leadership respond to that? And you see it, I mean, I see it constantly in the conversations I have, with the things I hear, the way people talk. There's just an air about, we're not going to go back to where things were. We need to reconfigure everything.
And if it's such a rapid and deep period of change, then we know a few things about change to be able to guide that. We know that if change is imposed top down, that it might get a reaction, that it will release an expectation that if I'm being told what to do, then there's an expert telling me what to do, so I'm going to therefore expect of the expert all of the answers. They will save us. And if it's more complex than that, then there's more involvement amongst people and more openness and more honesty and transparency about the whole situation and the complexity of it. Then this is a more involved leadership style as opposed to a top-down leadership style. Yeah. And does give people the opportunity to see exactly what possibilities there are and to contribute and to have their input on it, but with that, accept some of the complexity of it, that there's probably not a solution, ready-made solution that we can just deliver that will solve this and get us back to how it was before.
Yeah, and Anne, go on.
No, I just think as well, it's important to acknowledge that, it's been whatever you think about how our government have done and performed at the different stages, it's an unbelievably difficult task to bring everyone together around the decisions about who has priority. And I've been very impressed that people have not been able to in any way buy through influence or money their access to vaccines, for example. I mean, I think that's obviously we're doing better, and poorer countries. I'm not saying, I mean, just within our own democracy, it seems to me to be, have been led by leadership and personal example, and so much so that we've been amazed when the leaders have fallen up and haven't done what they say they're going to do. So I think there have been some modelings of equality of leadership. And as we've just been talking about, the polarity is maybe some of that's going to be taken back. If we need biometric passports, when we're allowed to go out more, we gain some freedom, we lose some more. So how are we going to share power in this new system? It's going to be very interesting. Yeah,
and Phil, you've made the comment about change traditionally as being top down, or someone somewhere has made a decision, and in whatever way they've done it, it's been filtered down through. I just suspect that actually change is going to be bottom up, because I think there are enough people in society generally who are now seeing that there are great disparities between one community and another, whether that be all of us squabbling in Northern Europe over vaccine supply when half the world still hasn't even got the vaccines, even if they wanted them, or whether it's a local person seeing that in the next village or the next town things are rather different in terms of access to local facilities, whatever it might be, whether it's employees thinking, well, actually, having worked from home, I rather like it and it works and I can do my day job and other things as well. I think that's I don't know, I'm just suggesting that I think change in now and in the future is going to be a lot more bottom up And we've noticed it a little bit in that some of the leaders, and it's not a blame thing, they have been accused of responding to things rather than sort of leading from the front. There have been all sorts of accusations around the world about organizations being behind the wave, or whatever the term is, being slightly behind it rather than in front of it. And in actually, the people in front of it are the young and the people who have got most to lose by not speaking up. And you just, I don't know, I just wonder whether that's something that is going to have an impact now and in the future, that we need to pay far more attention to the voices that are starting to be heard aloud, and less attention to our own small clique of sort of like-minded, clever, bright, senior people. I don't know.
And I think it's one of the things that happens with top-down leadership is there's then limited experience and expertise that exists amongst those senior leaders, and the people that they're leading are more likely to be closer to the problem, be more familiar with all of the different aspects of the situation, be more able to adapt to it from a very local, very recent experience. And that bottom-up approach that you've talked means more or less they will handle the change anyway, even if something's imposed on them.
Yeah.
The psychological contract will change and they'll make their own decisions about it. And so there's a certain amount of inevitability to it that as we adapt to change, those who are most familiar with it and closest to it will make the right decisions about it. Resourcing it is another problem, but it's one which I think does challenge the top-down idea that things are imposed and the reaction is handled, that it's much more a larger population in a company or an organization who will take care of themselves from that point of view.
Yeah, I'm convinced of it. And the other thing I think also that I've noticed or started to pay perhaps more attention to is that the power of the individual over the power of the group. That I made a comment on LinkedIn a while ago. You know, I just sort of casually, with some time on my hands, looked back over the major changes that had taken place in society, and an awful lot of them were driven by individuals rather than by organizations. It was individuals who said enough is enough, or people who said we've got to do something different. Someone took an action that had a ripple effect in their organization or in their community or in their society. And, you know, there have been some incredible examples, certainly in this country in the last 12 months, of people doing amazing things without needing any resources at all, without having some vast organization behind them. They've just said, let's just do something different. Let's change. And they've gone out and done it. Yeah,
the boy in the tent. I can't remember his name. Amazing boy, isn't he? He was given a tent by someone he admired. And he's raised £500,000 by sleeping outdoors for the last year. Staggering, really. I mean, I think what I'm thinking is, yes, there's that Margaret Mead quote, isn't there? Never doubt the power of a small group of people to change the world. It's what's happened and has always happened and always will. And I think that's terribly important that we still think that. And I think what you're both talking about, what's coming out for me, I suppose feeding through my own sort of filter system, is this idea of inclusivity. And, you know, I'm working in a couple of systems now that have been very parental and top down in the past, but are definitely being led much more by saying, well, what does the end user need? Whether it's a child who has special needs, a patient. So some of the public sector, hugely driven now to actually say, who is this system for? What are we doing, and what do they need? And let's be driven by that. And amazingly, or not, it's accompanied by big savings because it's more joined up and more focused on what they're trying to do and what systems need to be available and how do they interconnect in order to serve our client, our user. So I think this inclusivity is hugely important.
So for leaders who want to be inclusive, and for leaders who are not genuinely not taking a top-down approach, but want to involve everybody in seeking the solution to the challenges that they face, what should we do to advise them to make sure that they don't get derailed or that they don't get misread? Because there seems to be quite often a lot of well-intentioned actions that get hijacked by social media or just misrepresentation or deliberate sort of adversarial pushback against an imagined foe, as opposed to a leader who is not trying to impose something, but is trying to do something that is in line with well-intentioned values. How can they handle this? How can they involve people?
Well, I think one of the things, perhaps, but if we're talking about an organization that has investors, shareholders, stakeholders, who, for all sorts of probably very genuine reasons, need to get a return on their investment, whether it be a pension fund, it could be you and I, it could be anyone at that level. It's trying to navigate, I think, a new story, so that the outcome will be the same, but it's achieved through a different route. And so it's having that bravery to step back and challenge the way things are done at the moment, and the focus that is often placed on figures and numbers, and without removing that, because there is an element that is a part of a system, saying to oneself, well, if we actually focused on what we're actually doing for society, so whether that's customers or the wider community, so if everything is focused on who we are doing this for, and ultimately we're doing it for the greater good, and we're going to do it in a way that rapidly improves the way we treat the environment. And some companies have been incredibly successful with this. So it's not just, in a sense, moving to have slightly more paper than plastic packaging. It's much more fundamental than that. And we are going to engage with local communities within which we sit. And that is going to influence the decisions we make. What they say, how they respond to stuff is going to have an impact on us. Then I would argue that ultimately you're going to be a business that is profitable, is sustainable, does have a wonderful corporate reputation, but you've done it because you're focusing not on the things that you would have focused on in the past. You've focused on a whole raft of new criteria which are even more important. The focus purely on the monetary result led us down a route where we go to the bottom line on everything. What's the cheapest? What's the easiest? What's going to cause us the least amount of employment? What can we do to completely revolutionize everything to a point where it's so technically based, no one needs to be anywhere near it? What's the cheapest supply chain that we can get into? And if you look at some of the things that have happened, that one ship being blocked in the Suez Canal, and straight away, one ship, it wasn't a pandemic, it was one ship of 200,000 tons that caused most of the economies in the Northern Europe and the Western world to quake. 7 billion a day was being lost. We weren't getting our consignment of whatever it might be. Dare I say garden furniture in my case, whatever it was. I think we need to encourage at the leadership level to listen to people way down in our organizations, people outside of our immediate system, and focus on the really essential things that are going to be important for society moving forward. And I think out of that will come profit.
And how do we, as leaders in organizations, what's the best way to make sure everyone understands those decisions are being made in that way without virtue signaling or without putting themselves up on a pedestal? How do they get the message across to the people in their organisation that this is a set of decisions that are being made on different criteria, which they believe are the right criteria.
Well, I mean, I'm very tempted to mention the company, but it would be a bit unfair. But there is one that all three of us know, based in Norway, that's doing that exactly as we speak, and it's hugely impressive. You know, and it's done along the lines with a CEO who's recently in place, who has said, you know, this is the way we're changing our business and our organization, because this is what we think is for the future is important, both in terms of the way we produce stuff, the environment in which we work, and the communities which we work with and in. And yeah, it's very early days, but it's hugely impressive. It's got an enormous amount of coverage in social media, and rightly so. And people are sitting up and saying, hey, this is a possibility. It may not be true for all of us, but there's a real change of emphasis, and that's a client organisation I've worked with for 10 years, and it's just suddenly happened. New CEO, and this is the direction we're going to take the business in, and it's, I think, been received pretty favourably. I haven't heard that, you know, the stock market has crashed or shares have been devalued or pension companies have complained about it. And I just think there's something about being open like that, you know, whether it's local communities, organisations.
So what do we think that means for us working in leadership development? What do we need perhaps to give emphasis to in our work with them?
I suppose one thing would be to feel comfortable with challenge, to help them understand that it's comfortable to say you don't know, or it should be. It should be okay to say you're not sure or you don't know, but you have a viewpoint. I think, secondly, to be open to possibilities, help them to see that there may be another view of the world, another way of doing something that could, just could, have something in it that would make a lot of sense if they could just sort of park their current mindset, just hold it in abeyance for a moment. And I think, thirdly, to be prepared sometimes to receive criticism for doing it by those who perhaps aren't on the journey.
For me, the most recent thing that I've come across with this is many more conversations which are about senior leaders who are trying not to just take a top-down approach and respond to the pressures that are on them to take a top-down approach, but they need to involve people and still live with a little bit of the approach that they might want to take, where they just start to say, how am I going to involve people, ask them questions, get their ideas, but also possibly have to push back on 50% of those ideas. How do I do that without reverting back to my top-down approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe, you know, our role as a soundboard for leaders to kind of test out their ideas that are new is going to be even more important. You know, that's always been important. I think part of our role in coaching and facilitating the development of leaders is to sort of say to them, well, you know, what do you really want, and
yes,
and how might you apply that? And then it's like, oh, but you know, how will they feel? So it's kind of being courageous, isn't it? And also maybe not minding it not going perfectly. I think that's very hard often for leaders. They feel they're very visible, and their success or failure is very visible.
And not taking a top-down approach ourselves. So not advising them, but enabling them to expand their thinking through a discussion with it. Matthew, you're on mute.
Mute.
Yes, sorry, the COVID dog, as always, is showing it needs attention. Yeah, I think this is something we ought to explore over a period of time. I mean, we've got some young leaders joining us on the 30th, so the three of our most recent coachees Tamara, Ashita, and Rushni are going to join us on the 30th. It might be interesting to explore their views on it. I just think, I think it's something that we, and particularly if we're involved in coaching or in leadership development, it's something that we need to be mindful of. And I also think it's something that we don't address perhaps at the moment in quite the way we should, we need to. I think we need to sort of revisit some of the things that we develop.
Yeah, you know, I was just thinking as you said that Matthew, that there's people who are you know, very entrepreneurial and have a strong sense of what they can do and create in the world, and have enough, if you like, courage or chutzpah to just go out and do it. Whereas I think there's lots of other people who've got fantastic ideas, and then they go, well, I don't know, perhaps not, you know. And actually I think that it's those people that we need to encourage and say, great, and what's your next step? I mean, don't get completely put off by the whole line that you don't know how it's going to play out or how you're going to be able to do it. Just think about where you want to go and maybe what the next step is, so that they encourage people to go and to take their great idea forward, or more than done. I mean, that's about participation in society, isn't it? And having voices heard, that I think we're talking about, that I think is very important. Great, go and do it. How can I help you?
But and isn't that what you do as coaches? A lot
Absolutely.
of the time.
I think so. Yeah. What do you think, Phil?
Completely asking people difficult questions just to get them to consider what they might be doing differently, or persevering with the same, but to expand their thinking by challenging their thinking and challenging any frames or limitations that they're putting on that thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's leave it there for the time being. I mean, Brit, obviously, with her builders in Holland, has had some issues, so she had to dive out. And I think at some point I'll probably get our dog involved, because she gets involved anyway. Maybe I can sort of have her sitting here, sort of saying something erudite from a dog's perspective of all of this. But lovely to see you both. Thanks for joining us today. And have a very nice weekend. And for those who have been watching, if you'd like to say something, then please do. Great, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.